They don't fear love. If they did, they wouldn't crave it. They don't fear connection. If they did, they wouldn't feel drawn to you. What they fear is what love requires of who they believe they are. Because real love doesn't just ask for closeness. It asks for surrender. It asks for transparency. It asks for emotional responsibility. And for someone whose identity was built on self-reliance, emotional control, and never needing anyone, love doesn't feel romantic. It feels like collapse. They don't fear love. If they did, they wouldn't lean in the way they did in the beginning. They wouldn't study you. They wouldn't open up just enough to feel real. They wouldn't say, "This feels different." They don't fear connection. They fear what connection will dismantle. Because love, real love, is not just a feeling. It is an identity threat. And if you loved someone who slowly pulled away, the moment things became stable, the moment things became consistent, the moment you asked for clarity, you weren't watching someone lose feelings. You were watching someone protect the identity that helped them survive. Most people think avoidants fear intimacy. That's too shallow. They fear dependency. They fear emotional exposure. They fear engulfment. But even deeper than that, they fear becoming someone who needs, because somewhere in their early wiring, needing was dangerous. Needing meant disappointment. Needing meant rejection. Needing meant losing control. So they built an identity around self-containment. I don't need much. I'm independent. I'm not that emotional. I don't like labels. I just go with the flow. That identity kept them safe. It helped them function. It helped them avoid the vulnerability that once hurt them. But then you came along, and you didn't just offer affection. You offered consistency. You offered emotional presence. You offered depth. And depth doesn't just touch the heart. It touches structure. When you asked for reassurance, it wasn't just a request. It was pressure on their independence identity. When you said, "I want something real," it wasn't just romance. It was responsibility. And responsibility, to someone wired for emotional self-sufficiency, feels like exposure. Because to love you fully, they would have to admit they care. To care, they would have to risk loss. To risk loss, they would have to admit you matter. And that cracks the illusion that they are untouchable. Avoidants are not cold. They are controlled. Control is their safety. Emotional neutrality is their armor. And love removes armor, not all at once, but slowly. First, they start thinking about you more than they planned. Then, they start checking their phone more than they admit. Then, your mood affects theirs. Then, your distance unsettles them. Then, your approval matters. And that's when panic begins. Because now, their emotional state is influenced by someone else. That is identity erosion. For someone secure, that's intimacy. For someone avoidant, that's vulnerability overload. They don't consciously think, "I'm losing myself," but their nervous system does. Their nervous system reads closeness as loss of autonomy, loss of control, loss of emotional dominance. And when autonomy feels threatened, the body reacts. Distance, delay, silence, criticism, sudden confusion. It looks like mixed signals. It feels like rejection, but underneath, it is an identity defense. When love requires them to be emotionally accountable, they feel trapped. When love requires them to communicate feelings, they feel exposed. When love requires them to prioritize someone, they feel engulfed. And engulfment is not about you. It is about the fear that closeness will erase them. Because if you grew up learning that your needs weren't met, you adapt. You become the one who doesn't need. You become the one who doesn't expect. You become the one who leaves first. You become the one who controls attachment instead of surrendering to it. That becomes your identity. So when someone like you arrives, emotionally available, deep, consistent, you aren't just offering love. You are challenging the story they've lived by, and people will defend identity harder than they defend relationships. They can replace partners. They cannot easily replace who they believe they are. That's why, when things get real, they shift, not because you weren't enough, but because you were significant enough to disrupt the structure. There's a moment in avoidant relationships where everything feels perfect: chemistry, connection, intensity, future talk, and then suddenly, pull back. It feels irrational, but it's not. Early stage connection doesn't threaten identity. It's fantasy. Fantasy has no demands. Fantasy doesn't require consistency. Fantasy doesn't require integration. But real love does. Real love asks, can you stay when you're triggered? Can you communicate when you want to withdraw? Can you prioritize when independence feels safer? Can you be known? Being known is terrifying to someone who survived by emotional concealment, because if you see them fully, you might leave, and that fear is buried deep. So instead of risking abandonment, they create distance. Instead of risking exposure, they become vague. Instead of risking emotional reliance, they downplay what you had. It's not that serious. I'm just stressed. I need space. I don't know what I want. That last one is often true, because what they want is connection, but what their identity allows is distance. This creates inner conflict. They miss you, but they justify leaving. They think about you, but they silence themselves. They feel attachment, but they protect autonomy. This isn't confusion. It's fragmentation. Part of them wants intimacy. Part of them fears identity collapse. And when fear wins, you experience withdrawal. The tragedy is, many avoidants don't realize this is happening. They think they just lost feelings. They think something is off. They think you became too much. But what felt like too much was simply too close, too emotionally relevant, too structurally threatening. Because once they admit you matter deeply, they can't pretend they're unaffected anymore. And being unaffected is part of the persona: the cool one, the detached one, the rational one, the independent one. Love softens that. Love destabilizes that. Love asks them to become relational. And relational identity requires emotional risk. If they step into it, they must grieve the illusion that they don't need anyone. That's not small. That's existential. So when you say, they were so into me, then suddenly distant, what you witnessed was the moment love crossed into identity territory, the moment attachment became real, the moment your presence mattered enough to threaten autonomy. You were not too emotional. You were not asking for too much. You were asking for relational participation, and that requires identity evolution. Not everyone is ready to evolve. Some people prefer the safety of who they've been, even if it costs them who they could love. And this is where you must be careful, because when someone pulls away, it's easy to internalize it, to think, maybe I pushed too hard, maybe I expected too much, maybe I should have been calmer, less expressive, less intense. But intensity wasn't the issue. Relevance was. You became relevant. You became impactful. You became someone who could alter their internal balance. And that is terrifying to someone who built stability around self-containment. The deeper the connection, the louder the survival alarm. Not because love is bad, but because love requires surrender. And surrender To someone wired for control, feels like danger. Understanding this doesn't excuse poor behavior. It doesn't justify emotional neglect, but it explains the pattern. And explanation releases shame. You were never too much. You were just asking someone to step beyond who they learned to be. And that step felt like falling. So they retreated into the identity that feels safe, independent, detached, unmoved. But beneath that, there is conflict. Because love did reach them, it just reached the part they haven't integrated yet. And until someone is willing to let love reshape their identity, they will protect who they've been more than who they could become. When love begins to feel real, the avoidant doesn't think, I'm afraid of losing this person. They think, without words, I'm losing control. And control is not ego for them. It is safety. From the outside, it looks like they are calm, composed, unbothered. But internally, when attachment deepens, their nervous system starts scanning, not for love, for threat, because intimacy activates memory, not conscious memory, body memory, moments where vulnerability wasn't met, moments where needs felt ignored, moments where closeness ended in disappointment. So when you begin to matter, their body doesn't say, this is beautiful. It says, this could hurt. And that is where identity steps in. Their identity was built to prevent hurt, to prevent dependency, to prevent emotional chaos. They may pride themselves on being logical, on being independent, on not overreacting. But underneath that pride is strategy. If I don't rely on anyone, I won't be devastated. If I don't need reassurance, I won't be disappointed. If I don't define this, I can leave when I need to. This strategy works when love is light, when connection is casual, when no one expects much. But when someone, like you, brings depth, the strategy cracks. Because depth requires response. Depth requires presence. Depth requires emotional availability. And availability means risk. So what happens? They begin to regulate distance. Not because they don't care, but because they care. Too much for their comfort. They delay replies. They create space. They become vague. They focus on work, on distractions, on independence. This isn't random. It's restabilization. Their nervous system is trying to return to equilibrium. And equilibrium for them means autonomy without emotional dependence. If you notice closely, their withdrawal often happens after closeness peaks, after a vulnerable conversation, after intimacy deepens, after future talk, after you express what they mean to you. That's not coincidence. That's activation. Because now, the relationship isn't abstract. It's binding. It has emotional weight. And emotional weight presses on identity. Love says, you are connected. Identity says, I survive alone. Those two cannot coexist without tension. So tension turns into distance. Sometimes they don't even understand why they feel restless, why small things irritate them, why they suddenly feel unsure. It's not that you changed. It's that the relationship moved from fantasy to responsibility. And responsibility requires integration. Integration means allowing someone to influence you, to affect your decisions, to impact your emotional state. For someone secure, that's intimacy. For someone avoidant, that feels like loss of self, because their sense of self was built around not being influenced, not needing reassurance, not depending on anyone. So when they catch themselves thinking about you constantly, missing you, feeling anxious when you pull back, they experience something unfamiliar: vulnerability. And vulnerability is interpreted as weakness, not consciously, but structurally. It clashes with who they believe they are. This is why they sometimes minimize the relationship. It wasn't that serious. We moved too fast. I just need space. They're not always lying. They're reframing. Because reframing protects identity. If it wasn't serious, then they're still in control. If it was moving too fast, then the problem was pacing. If they just need space, then they aren't rejecting connection. They're preserving autonomy. Autonomy is sacred to them, not because they don't value love, but because autonomy feels predictable. Love doesn't. Love introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty activates old wounds. When you said, I want something real, you weren't demanding control. You were asking for mutuality. But mutuality means shared influence. Shared influence means they can be affected, and being affected means they can be hurt. Avoidants often learned early that being emotionally affected was overwhelming, so they taught themselves to detach, to compartmentalize, to rationalize feelings instead of feeling them. But love bypasses logic. You can't analyze your way out of attachment, and that loss of control is destabilizing. This is why some avoidants become critical when they start caring deeply. They'll point out flaws, create subtle distance, shift tone. It's not always about you. It's about restoring internal balance. If they convince themselves you're not ideal, then stepping back feels justified. If they find reasons why it won't work, then they regain narrative control. Because the alternative is admitting, I'm scared of how much this means to me. And that confession requires identity expansion. Identity expansion is painful. It feels like losing who you were. For someone who built their self-concept around independence, becoming emotionally interdependent feels like erosion. But here's the truth most people miss. Avoidants don't lose themselves in love. They lose the version of themselves that never needed anyone. And that version kept them safe once. So letting it go feels dangerous. When you ask for consistency, you're not asking for control. You're asking for reliability. But reliability requires ongoing emotional presence. Presence requires staying when uncomfortable, and discomfort is exactly what their system tries to avoid. So they retreat, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes both. And you're left wondering how someone who felt so close could suddenly feel distant. It's because closeness crossed the threshold from enjoyable to identity threatening. There is a moment in avoidant dynamics where they realize, if I continue down this path, this will change me. And change is uncertain. Uncertainty feels unsafe. So they pull back before transformation completes. This doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. Often, they feel more than they show. But expression is tied to identity. If their identity says, I don't need reassurance, they will suppress the urge to ask for it. If their identity says, I don't depend on people, they will silence the longing to reach out. This suppression creates tension. Tension builds into overwhelm. Overwhelm leads to distance, and distance feels safer than emotional exposure. From your side, it feels like rejection. From theirs, it feels like self-preservation. That doesn't make it fair. It doesn't make it healthy, but it makes it understandable. And understanding changes how you interpret the story. Because if someone pulls away, when things get serious, it's rarely about you being unworthy. It's about them confronting a version of themselves they're not ready to release. Love is not the enemy. Transformation is. And transformation requires letting go. of outdated survival roles. If they grew up believing they must handle everything alone, then partnership feels like surrendering competence. If they equated emotional expression with instability, then vulnerability feels like chaos. If they survive by detaching, then attachment feels like risk. So when you love them consistently, you weren't overwhelming them. You were inviting evolution. And evolution is not comfortable. It requires grieving who you used to be. It requires tolerating emotional exposure. It requires learning how to stay without shutting down. Not everyone is willing to do that work. At the moment, love demands it. Some need years, some never do. And this is where your power shifts. Because once you understand that their withdrawal is about identity protection, you stop chasing, you stop over-explaining, you stop shrinking, you stop trying to make yourself smaller so they can feel bigger. Because love should not require you to disappear so someone else can stay intact. Healthy love allows both identities to expand, not one to collapse, while the other resists growth. When you internalize that, something changes. You begin to see distance, not as proof that you were too much, but as evidence that they reached their capacity. Capacity is personal. Capacity can grow, but only if someone chooses to stretch. You cannot stretch it for them. You cannot evolve their identity for them. You cannot love them into readiness. They must decide that who they've been is no longer enough for the kind of connection they desire. And until they do, they will hover between craving intimacy and defending autonomy. That push-pull is not romantic tension. It is unresolved identity conflict, an understanding that protects you from internalizing their fear as your failure. There is a moment most people never see. It doesn't happen in an argument. It doesn't happen in silence. It happens internally. It's the moment they realize you are no longer casual. You are no longer convenient. You are becoming consequential. And that is when the conflict sharpens. Because once someone becomes consequential, they have impact. They can influence mood. They can influence decisions. They can influence self-perception. For an avoidant, being influenced feels dangerous. Not because influence is bad, but because it threatens autonomy. Autonomy isn't just preference to them. It is identity armor. It is proof that they are capable, self-contained, untouched by emotional dependency. When you start maturing deeply, that armor cracks. And cracks feel like exposure. Exposure feels like weakness. So instead of saying, "I'm scared of how important you are to me," they say, "I just need space." Or, "I don't know what I want." Or worse, they create distance without explanation. Because explanation would require ownership. Ownership would require vulnerability. Vulnerability would require them to admit that love is changing them. And change means stepping into unfamiliar territory. Most avoidants do not fear affection. They fear integration. Integration means allowing someone to exist inside your inner world without defense. It means sharing decision-making, sharing emotional weight, sharing uncertainty. That level of merging activates early attachment memory. If closeness once felt engulfing, they fear being swallowed. If closeness once felt inconsistent, they fear being abandoned. If closeness once felt chaotic, they fear losing stability. So even when love is healthy, their nervous system reacts as if it isn't. This is why you might notice that when you become more secure, more grounded, less reactive, they sometimes feel even more uneasy. Because your stability removes distraction. When you're chasing, they feel powerful. When you're anxious, They feel needed. But when you are calm, when you stand in clarity, when you say, I want mutual effort, you remove their familiar dynamic. And now they must confront themselves, not your neediness, not your emotion, themselves. And that confrontation is what they truly avoid. Identity collapse does not look dramatic. It looks like restlessness. It looks like irritability. It looks like suddenly focusing on flaws. It looks like intellectualizing feelings. It looks like convincing themselves they lost the spark. But the spark didn't die. The spark matured. And maturity requires responsibility. Responsibility requires presence. Presence requires tolerating discomfort. Avoidance often confuse discomfort with incompatibility. If it feels heavy, it must be wrong. If it feels intense, it must be unhealthy. But intensity isn't always toxicity. Sometimes it's transformation. And transformation shakes structure. When love asks them to become more open, more expressive, more emotionally available, it threatens the version of themselves that survived by shutting down. Letting go of that version feels like betrayal of their past because that version protected them from chaos, from rejection, from feeling too much. So when you show up with depth and emotional literacy, you are not overwhelming them. You are outgrowing their defense system. And defense systems do not like to be outgrown. They fight. They rationalize. They retreat. They seek relief in distance. Distance restores identity. Distance says, I'm still independent. Distance says, I'm still in control. Distance says, I didn't lose myself. But distance also creates longing. And that's the part people don't talk about. Avoidants don't walk away and feel nothing. They often feel relief first. Relief from pressure. Relief from expectation. Relief from emotional exposure. But relief is temporary. Because once the nervous system settles, the attachment remains. They miss you. They think about you. They replay conversations. But reaching out means admitting attachment. Admitting attachment means accepting influence. Accepting influence means acknowledging that love changed them. And that is the ego death. Ego death is not destruction. It is evolution. But evolution requires surrender. Surrender requires trust. Trust requires vulnerability. And vulnerability was once unsafe. So the loop continues. They hover between longing and avoidance, between missing you and staying silent, between wanting intimacy and fearing its cost. From the outside, it can look manipulative. From the inside, it feels destabilizing. This does not excuse inconsistency, but it explains the pattern. When someone has built their self-image around not needing anyone, real love exposes the illusion. Because if they truly didn't need anyone, your absence wouldn't affect them. Your silence wouldn't matter. Your withdrawal wouldn't sting. But it does. And that sting reveals attachment. Attachment reveals dependency. Dependency threatens identity. So instead of integrating that truth, they try to suppress it. They distract. They date casually. They immerse in work. They convince themselves. They prefer freedom. But freedom without connection eventually feels empty. And that emptiness is quieter than panic, but deeper. Avoidants are not immune to longing. They just process it privately, often silently, often stubbornly, because admitting that they need someone requires rewriting their internal narrative, and rewriting identity takes courage. Courage requires willingness to sit in discomfort without fleeing. That is the developmental leap. Some make it, some don't. If they do, it often comes after loss, after realizing that autonomy without intimacy feels incomplete, After understanding that strength does not mean isolation, after confronting the truth that love does not erase identity, it refines it. But if they don't make that leap, they will repeat the cycle: attraction, closeness, activation, distance, relief, longing, silence. The person changes, the pattern stays. And this is where your awareness becomes critical, because once you see that their avoidance is identity defense, you stop personalizing their retreat. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and start asking, "Do they have the capacity to grow beyond this version of themselves?" Love alone does not expand capacity. Intention does. Self-reflection does. Emotional accountability does. Without those, attachment remains arrested, and you remain in a loop with someone who equates intimacy with self-loss. Healthy partnership requires two people willing to evolve, not one evolving while the other defends. You cannot convince someone that transformation is safe. They must experience it within themselves. They must realize that vulnerability does not equal annihilation, that interdependence does not erase individuality, that being influenced does not mean being controlled. Until they internalize that, love will always feel like a negotiation between closeness and self-protection. And you deserve someone who sees love not as identity collapse, but as identity expansion. Someone who understands that intimacy does not dismantle strength, it deepens it, because real strength is not the ability to stand alone. It is the ability to stay connected without losing yourself. That is maturity, that is security, and that is the difference between someone who fears love and someone who fears becoming, who love requires them to be. There is something even deeper than fear of intimacy, deeper than fear of commitment, deeper than fear of vulnerability. It is the fear of being redefined. Because when love is real, it does not just add someone to your life. It reorganizes your internal world. Your priorities shift. Your emotional rhythms shift. Your future thinking shifts. Your self-concept shifts. And if your self-concept was built around, "I'm better alone, I don't rely on anyone, I don't get attached," then real love is not romantic. It is disruptive. When you entered their life, you didn't just offer affection, you offered mirroring. And mirroring forces awareness. You saw their tenderness. You saw their depth. You saw the parts they usually hide. And when someone sees you that clearly, you can no longer pretend those parts don't exist. That is identity pressure. Because now they must choose. Stay who they've always been. Protected, controlled, detached. Or become someone capable of sustained intimacy. And becoming requires grief. Grieving the illusion of invulnerability. Grieving the belief that needing someone is weakness. Grieving the comfort of emotional distance. Most people underestimate this stage. They think love failing means feelings faded, but often feelings intensified, and the structure couldn't hold them. You felt them pull away, right when things felt deeper. That wasn't coincidence. That was threshold. There is always a threshold moment. It's subtle. It might be when you asked, "Where is this going?" It might be when you expressed hurt calmly. It might be when you stopped chasing. It might be when you showed you could walk away. That moment forces internal confrontation. If they step forward, they evolve. If they step back, they preserve identity. Many step back because stepping forward requires dismantling the defense system that once saved them. And defense systems don't dissolve gently. They resist. They create narratives. "She's too intense. This is moving too fast. I just need space." I'm not ready. Sometimes they genuinely believe it because awareness is uncomfortable. But here's the part that matters for you. When someone cannot love you without feeling like they are losing themselves, it does not mean you are overpowering. It means their sense of self was never integrated. Secure love does not erase identity. It refines it. It strengthens it. It allows two individuals to remain whole while connected. If someone feels erased by closeness, they have not yet developed relational identity. And relational identity is the capacity to stay emotionally open without collapsing or fleeing. That capacity is built, not demanded. You cannot build it for them. You cannot love them into it. You cannot prove your safety enough to override their wiring. They must choose growth over comfort. They must choose expansion over protection. They must choose to risk being changed because love will change you. Real love always does. It softens rigid edges. It exposes unhealed places. It asks for accountability. It requires emotional stamina. And for someone attached to independence, as proof of strength, that feels destabilizing. So what happens next? One of two paths. Either they reflect, they recognize the pattern, they notice the way they retreat. When closeness deepens, they confront the fear of self-loss, and they slowly begin to integrate, or they repeat. New person, new chemistry, new intensity, same threshold, same withdrawal, same narrative. Because identity protection will always override desire until awareness interrupts it. This is why your power is not in convincing. It is in clarity. Clarity about what you experienced. Clarity about what you deserve. Clarity about what you will not shrink to accommodate. When you understand that their withdrawal was an identity defense, not your inadequacy, you stop chasing explanation. You stop rewriting yourself. You stop lowering depth. You stop apologizing for needing reciprocity. And something shifts. Because when you no longer pursue someone who fears becoming more, you create contrast. Contrast creates reflection. Reflection creates discomfort. And discomfort is the beginning of growth. Not begging, not convincing, not emotional overfunctioning, just grounded withdrawal of overgiving. That is not manipulation. It is alignment. If they are capable of growth, your absence of pursuit will force introspection. If they are not, your clarity will protect your future. Either way, you win because you are no longer negotiating with someone's fear of evolution. You are standing inside your own. Love should feel like expansion, not like you must become smaller to keep someone steady. If someone needs you to dim so they don't feel overwhelmed, they are not overwhelmed by you. They are overwhelmed by intimacy. And intimacy is the doorway to identity transformation. The question is never, did they love me? Often they did. The real question is, were they willing to become who loving me required? That is deeper. That is harder. And that is where most people hesitate. So instead of asking why they pulled away, ask yourself something more powerful. Are you willing to attach your future to someone who fears growth? Or are you ready for someone who sees love not as identity collapse, but as identity evolution? If this shifted something for you, don't just scroll past it. Pause, reflect, and in the comments, write one word. Expand, not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because the moment you choose expansion over shrinking to fit someone's fear, you stop chasing love and start embodying it.